Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here, and together with our partners at the U.S. Naval Institute and Vice Admiral Pete Daly, who's just taking his seat, representing them here today, we're happy to bring you our Maritime Security Dialogue. And today we're especially happy to be inviting to speak the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zukunft. Admiral Zukunft was kind enough to come here to CSIS I think it was about 17 months ago, so this is a great update on everything that's happened for and with the Coast Guard in the meantime, which has been significant. He, as you may well know, Admiral Zukunft has extensive operational command experience prior to being the Commandant of the Coast Guard in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, and of note, he was the federal on-scene coordinator for the Deepwater Horizon spill. And he directed there more than 47,000 responders, 6,500 vessels, and 120 aircraft dealing with the largest oil spill in U.S. history. So I think you can agree that he has both the extensive international experience and the Homeland Security experience necessary for any Commandant in the Marine Corps. For the Coast Guard. Sorry about that. You can be a Marine Corps Commandant as well, I have no doubt. Before we begin today, I do want to just go through our safety procedures. We have doors behind us, and then we have this door behind me that leads to the back of the building. This leads to the front of the building. This is our normal safety precautions that we relay to you, and I will be here to direct you in the case a fire alarm goes off or something along those lines. I want to also thank our sponsors for this event and for the whole series, and that is Lockheed Martin International and Huntington Ingalls Industries. So thank you to both of them for making this series possible. And without further ado, over to you, Admiral Zukunft.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, and it's good to see so many familiar faces here. And first of all, it's a somber week. Let's face it. 49 is the last count, and I know there are families mourning, and it's always mindful of, the threats that face us on a day-to-day basis. And certainly, those are the threats that we always look at in the Coast Guard and the maritime domain as well. But what I'd like to open up with here first is when I came into this job just over 2 years ago. On day one, we put out my Commandant's direction. And usually there's a tendency of, well, let me wait 6 months and I'll study, see what's going on, and then I'll provide my direction. But I realized I only have 4 years. And so you don't have 6 months to waste. And so the first day one is we put out my Commandant's direction. And the first piece of that was about service to nation. And then the way we broke that down is, first of all, strategy needs to drive our budget. For nearly 225 years, we've always looked at, okay, here's our budget, now what do we do with it? And it was, we were doing what was left over and really not looking at what our unique authorities are and where do we plug and play on a global scale, not just here in the homeland, but worldwide as well. So not just strategy driving budget, but also intelligence driving operations. We've been a member of the National Intelligence Community now for 14 years. But it's not just driving the operations, it's also driving where you do not operate. Where you apply what I would call risk-based decision making. We have 11 statutory missions. And historically, we would try to fill all 11 of those buckets up equally, but recognizing some of those buckets are already pretty healthy. I looked at our international fisheries enforcement, and we had a compliance rate of over 95%. And then I looked at what was happening in the Western Hemisphere, and on any given day, we had intelligence on over 80–85% of the drug flow ultimately destined for the United States. 80–85%, but on the best of days, we could target 10%, which means over 70–75% of that gets a free pass. So we started looking at the external environment, and we said, well, let's put a series of strategies together. I can't forecast out 10, 15, 20 years, but I can certainly look out 5 years, which is what we did last year, and we put out a 5-year strategic intent. Looking at the socioeconomic influences, not just here in the United States, but on a global scale. What's happening in the European Union, where you have countries that are struggling economically, and yet you have a rising China, you have a rising Southeast Asia, And many of the maritime nations of the world are not trying to build navies, they're trying to build coast guards because they see their most intrinsic threats in a maritime domain is human trafficking, illegal fishing, smuggling, and the like, and of course, natural disasters, search and rescue. And in fact, at the International Sea Power Symposium in 2014, I felt like the agenda was hijacked because it became very Coast Guard-like. But many of the maritime nations of the world, they can't afford, and they certainly can't duplicate the best Navy in the world, and that is our United States Navy, second to none, and always will be. So my plug for that as well. But we recognize that discretionary budgets are not going to grow anytime soon, and we also recognize there will be a change in administration. So we factored all of that in as we try to look out over the next 5 years of the Coast Guard, and where do our authorities resonate globally, where we bring the best return on investment. Then we went off with a number of regional and functional strategies. One of those is our strategy for the Western Hemisphere. When I arrived in the job that year, we had 68,000 unaccompanied minors, primarily from the countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, leaving those countries in the hands of a human trafficker to make safe arrival in the United States. And so the first thing I did as the chairman of the Interdiction Committee within the Office of the National Drug Control Policy, I went down with a number of principals here in DC, and we met with the presidents of the tri-border regions. We met with the president in Colombia and Panama as well. And we said, well, why are these young children leaving? And probably the most sobering account of this was when I met with President Cerrone in El Salvador. And he says it's like this. The parents right now, they're taking their kids out of school because they're afraid that they will either be co-opted or be forced to join a gang. And this is a country right now that has 40% unemployment, 50% poverty, and now you're pulling this next generation, out of a higher education. And so where is El Salvador going to be in the next 15 to 20 years? And then when I ask there or in Honduras or Guatemala, and I say, why the violence? A year ago, Honduras was the most violent nation in the world. The murder rates were approaching nearly 100 per 100,000. And President Hernandez said, well, the problem is when these drugs arrive in bulk and they land in my country, the first thing that we lose is rule of law. The money is so great, I can't pay law enforcement enough to police this activity. So if you can keep this offshore or prevent it from coming onshore, I can then address the security environment of my country. But as soon as this, it's like money falling from the sky, but in this case, it arrives in bales of cocaine. And again, 75% of it is getting through. He says, if you can do that, then you can have an impact. So again, intelligence driving operations and driving how we manage risk. We doubled down on our Coast Guard presence in the transit zone in the Western Hemisphere. Didn't do it by ourselves. We had great support by Customs and Border Protection and HSI within the Department of Homeland Security and the National Intelligence Community, Department of Justice, DEA, FBI, just to name a few others, all in on this as well. And so last year, we removed 191 metric tons of cocaine, and we took 700 smugglers into custody for prosecution here in the United States. The prosecution rate here is about 98%. The prosecution rate in Honduras is 2%. So you don't have to be a math wizard to figure out where you get the best return on investment. And so we've continued that effort this year as well. So remember, last year, 191 metric tons, over 700 smugglers. 6 months into this year, we have removed over 245 metric tons of cocaine. We are on a glide slope to remove over 400 metric tons, and we've taken 400 smugglers into custody as well. It's not just the volume, it's the ill-gotten gains, and it's what this is doing to regional stability in Central America. So when I look at the cooperative strategy for the 21st century, and we are written into that as well, the Navy is and must be deployed elsewhere, and they are, whether it's the repositioning to the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, but when we start looking at where those gaps and seams, there's a significant one in the Western Hemisphere right now. At a point in time where the Perry-class frigates who are really doing the lion's share of our enforcement activity with Coast Guard law enforcement teams embarked on those platforms, are no longer in service. So we've doubled down there. We've also looked at the Arctic to the north, and it is no big secret that the waters of the Arctic is opening, and with it we've seen about a 300% increase in human activity in the Arctic. I was up there last year when Shell was drilling in the Burger oil field in the Chukchi Sea. And conservative estimates are that about 13% of the world's oil and about a third of the world's natural gas and about $1 trillion worth of minerals reside on the seafloor up in the Arctic region. Well, it's probably not profitable to exploit that when oil is hovering, just north and south of $50 a barrel. Is it going to stay that way forever? But if nothing else, you can look at that oil and gas that is up there as strategic reserves of the United States. You can also look at the fact that we've done extensive sea mapping, beyond our traditional 200-mile economic exclusive zone up in the Arctic, and it's nearly twice the area of the state of California. But we've seen other nations up there doing scientific research and establishing a pattern of operating in this very same area as well, recognizing that the United States is the only Arctic nation that has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. We're seeing more and more human activity. The cruise ship Crystal Serenity will depart this August, and they will transit through the Bering Strait, through the Northwest Passage, and then eventually return to New York. And an area that is charted, about 5% of the Arctic today is charted to what we would say 21st century standards. And I was in Iceland not that long ago, and I was on the Icelandic Coast Guard vessel Thor. And I was talking to the captain. I went up to the chart room, and there on the chart, the datum for that chart is 1915, when Ernest Shackleton on the Endurance was writing, rewriting history in terms of man's resilience, fighting Mother Nature. But now you have cruise shipping activity plying these very same waters. Today, the Coast Guard still flies the International Ice Patrol following the sinking of the Titanic 104 years ago. And so what happens if we have an event, a cruise ship, if you will, that finds an uncharted pinnacle or is otherwise beset in ice? These are not ice-breaking cruise ships that are up there. So we start looking at what our needs are for presence. The United States can't do it alone. And so just this past week, I was in Boston and I met with all of the heads of the Arctic Coast Guards, all 7 other countries. And we had the lead. I was the chair of this. We had Russia there. And this is no easy feat, but it's the one area where we have an open dialogue with our Russian counterparts in terms of how to reframe the strategic environment of the Arctic. And they too are concerned with the amount of human activity, shipping going through there. What if you have an oil spill? And Russia admits, even with the fleet of icebreakers that they have, they do not have the capacity to deal with the challenges in the Arctic. The first thing we need to do is set up a communication protocol, an information exchange where we can communicate with one another 24/7 and share domain awareness of what is happening in the high north latitudes. And so in March, we will meet one last time while we chair the Arctic Council to finalize these operating guidelines for the Arctic as well. And you might say, well, will there be other cruise shipping activities? I know what the price per passage is if I want to book a fare on the Crystal Serenity. It's a lot. And if I'm in the cruise shipping industry, this is a business. And so you might want to get in on this business, and I fully anticipate we will see more and more cruise shipping into this very pristine environment coming up in the future as well. So we're not done there. We also looked at what's happening in the cyber domain, and I know all of you follow cyber, but I look at primarily through the maritime transportation lens. I was out at Long Beach earlier this year, and it looked like something out of Star Wars, even though that's where George Lucas got the design for those robots. But no, there's these vehicles, autonomous vehicles, moving containers across the yard, and they're unmanned. And in fact, they're using liquefied natural gas, so there's very little carbon footprint. But they put transponders down beneath the tarmac of this entire container terminal, and they're using a GPS signal. But they realize if there's a disruption in that GPS signal, they've got resiliency. And in fact, this robot, when it senses that its battery pack is down, they also run on batteries, it'll go to the charging station, robot pulls it out, puts another one in, they go back to work. And I don't think it costs all that much per hour to move these things around, but a huge investment. But we have seen ships that have been disrupted by cyber. We've seen mobile offshore drilling units move off their drilling circle, which means that blowout preventer had to kick in, shut in that well, because that main control console lost the ability to communicate with the thrusters. And so now you have, it could have been another Deepwater Horizon, but in this case, that blowout preventer worked. And it's happened on more than one occasion. It's a big cost to the industry, literally millions. It costs roughly $1 million a day to rent, to lease a mobile offshore drilling unit. But when you look at lost productivity time, reestablishing well control, obviously the cost goes up as well. So industry is keenly attuned to operating in a cyber domain. Even something as fundamental as you have to replace a part. How do you know there's not malware in that part as well? So we've reached out to the International Maritime Organization, and we've held a number of town halls. And normally industry does not want to be regulated, and yet they realize if we're going to change behavior, it may require a regulatory regime, best practices of how does industry stay ahead of the cyber threats of today. Our financial sector, about 95+% of our financial sector is behind a bona fide firewall in protecting very sensitive information. Our maritime transportation system, on the other hand, is about 25%. And about 90% of our global trade moves by sea. So it is a very vulnerable segment of our economic prosperity, but more importantly, our economic security, and with that, our national security. Then another area I'm looking at is within the energy sector. When we wrote this energy policy, oil at that time was going for $100 per barrel. Every day, a new tank barge was entering the Mississippi River. This was Bakken crude. In fact, we saw a 50-fold increase in downbound barge traffic carrying Bakken crude. You saw what happened just a week ago when a train derails, very strong light ends, very volatile substance, but there's also a heavy end to this as well. It has about the same specific gravity as water as those lighter ends bleed off, and then it sinks in the water. Now, something to be mindful of, earlier this year, we had record flooding in the interior of the United States, which means you have high river conditions, and so there's a big difference pushing a barge downriver versus upriver. When you're going downriver, it's like going down Skyline Parkway with a double semi with no brakes. It's very difficult to stop these things. And we saw a number of bridge collisions. Most of these were grain barges because they weren't moving crude at the time. But when that sinks and then it gets into those water intakes, we need to make sure that we're ready to respond to those scenarios as well. But at the end of the day, we need to keep that inland highway of ours open and robust. At the same time, we inspect all of these barges. We're producing LNG in record levels, and we're just starting to push LNG into the global market right now. There's a lot of competition out there. I think we will see a supply glut of LNG in the near term, but the United States sits on the highest volume of natural gas of any other country in the world. Huge, huge economic potential there. And so why is that important to me is that we regulate. So it gets back to our regulatory roles and our inspection regime. And if I'm not training that next generation to be in front of industry rather than lagging it, then we will then become an impediment and not a facilitator of this commerce as well. So we're paying very close attention to that. On the next piece of that, we are investing in the Coast Guard like never before. Up there you'll see a couple of pictures, if I got the right one queued up, and you do. We just awarded the second phase of our fast response cutters. It's 154 feet in length, just doing yeoman duty in the Straits of Florida today. Several occasions we probably evaded a mass migration from Cuba because we had enough ships out there to stop them and interdicting most of those folks trying to find a better life here in the United States. And some may ask, well, shouldn't we be sending these ships over to the Mediterranean and to the Aegean Sea? Well, there's an opportunity cost if you do that. If you do that, we have a migration problem, a maritime migration challenge here in the United States as well. So do we go to the aid of the EU and then we leave our borders, our maritime borders exposed? And those are the trade-off risk-based decisions that we have to make. And so we look at that as well. We were missionizing 14 C-27J fixed-wing aircraft. These we acquired at no cost from the U.S. Air Force, and we're missionizing those to help in our ISR capability. This year, we were awarded long lead time materials for our 9th national security cutter. Our program of record was 8, but there was funding to go ahead and build a 9th one of these as well. Is there work for 9 national security cutters? Absolutely. In fact, this last year, 2 of our national security cutters, Berthoff and Stratton, the Stratton came back a little less than a year ago with 32 metric tons of cocaine on it. That is enough to literally fill this room to the ceiling with pure cocaine. The Berthoff didn't do quite as well. They filled this room about 3/4 of the way to the ceiling, but they interdicted 3 self-propelled semi-submersibles, which the only way you find these is through intelligence. And that's where this whole of government comes into play, and it's the ability of these platforms to leverage intelligence so we can optimally position those where the greatest threats may exist as well. So we're building those out as well. At the end of this fiscal year, we will award final design for what will be the largest acquisition in Coast Guard history, and that is our offshore patrol cutter. You can see the three bidders that we have up there. We have Bollinger Shipyard, Eastern Shipbuilding, and then we also have Bath Iron Works vying for that down select that we will make by the end of the fiscal year. 25 ships in that program of record, which, as I said, will be the largest acquisition in Coast Guard history. Great dynamic seakeeping capabilities as we look at where we might be operating over the next 40+ years, with an emphasis on affordability. Affordability becomes the operative word for this program of record. And then finally, on the upper left, what you see is, there is a posturing statement within this administration and within this Senate appropriations bill going forward that would look at investing in heavy icebreakers. This is a dialogue that we have had for the last 15 years. We've already put out on Fed Biz Ops over 4 months ago what you need a heavy icebreaker to do. And so we consulted with Navy, National Science Foundation, Arctic Research Council, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce. Yeah, there are a lot of stakeholders that have Arctic equities to make sure if you're going to build a heavy icebreaker, does it meet the needs of whole of government? And so we've already done that due diligence, including the operational requirement document that has been submitted to OMB as well. We've already hired acquisition staff personnel so we can get a jump start if we have an appropriation to move forward. And then we held an open house with industry. We held one 2 years ago when there was $3 million in our heavy icebreaking budget, and guess what? I had 3, count them, 3 people that expressed an interest in heavy icebreakers. They said if you were serious, you'd be showing real money. Now, when I hosted that, there was a mark of $150 million at that point in time for 17, and we had nearly 300 interested parties, including international, in terms of heavy icebreakers. So tremendous interest in that recapitalization effort as well. So it's great that we are recapitalizing the Coast Guard and modernizing it as never before. And as many services will probably testify to at a budget hearing, is you can usually do one of 3 things. You can modernize, you can build and restore readiness, or you can build force structure. But rarely do you get to do all 3 at the same time. We are modernizing. Our readiness, we don't have a force and garrison, so the fact that the Coast Guard operates 24/7, I don't have to worry about a force and garrison and get them ready to deploy because they're already deployed. So our readiness levels have been sustained at a pretty high level. And we are gradually growing back some of our force structure as well. But it takes me to the final strategy, and probably the most important one that I put out is our human capital strategy. How do you manage talent in the 21st century? And so before I did this, I spent some time out in Silicon Valley. How does Google, how does Tesla, How does Microsoft, how do the others, how do they manage their talent? And of course, they said, well, hey, we'd love to hire veterans. I said, no, you don't need to hire my workforce away from me. Thank you, but no thanks. But right now, about 25% of Americans, male, female, between the ages of 17 and 24, meet the bare minimum requirements to serve in the United States military. We are a service going for that top 10%, not the bottom 10%. And I'm sure all my service chief counterparts would say the exact same thing. Well, that's who Silicon Valley is going after as well. And at a point in time where we're seeing in the energy sector, in the cyber domain, even in the airline industry, there's a hiring boom taking place around us right now. So we're doing a great job recruiting people. We're doing a great job recruiting diversity. The class of 2020 will arrive at our Coast Guard Academy in 2 weeks. In that class will be 40% women and 1/3 underrepresented minorities. That will mirror image the classes of 19 and 18. In fact, our Coast Guard Academy today is the most diverse it has ever been across every spectrum of our demographic than it has ever been in our Coast Guard history. I'm very proud of that. Build it, they will come. We needed that critical mass, they're there. But then I look out 10 years, and when I look out 10 years, we lose roughly 50% of our female officers out of a given year group. And why is that? We're losing about 50% of our underrepresented minority officers out of a given year group. And why is that? Can you be married, have a family, have those challenging positions, and do it all and still serve our nation? Where nearly 50% of the women in our service are married to other service members, not just Coast Guard. And so how do you manage that dual career track? So we're very interested in what's happening across the river over at the Pentagon as we start looking at future force of the 21st century. And so we're very engaged in that as well. But we're a very specialized Coast Guard. We're no longer the jack of all trades, master of some. If you saw the movie The Finest Hours with Bernie Weber still going out, even though his compass has been washed off, well, we'd probably launch something else besides that boat today. But that is a very perishable skill set operating in those breaking bars, and we have bosun mates that do it better than anybody else. And so I need to start specializing within some of our specialties across the Coast Guard. Cyber is a specialty. Inspection regimes is a specialty. Diving, hazmat response, that's a specialty. And so acquisition, our legal profession, you need all of these to make this Coast Guard machine tick. And too many times, members of more junior members feel like they're in the less favored community within the Coast Guard. It doesn't matter if you drive a ship, fix a ship, or provide intelligence to a ship, or provide ISR for a ship, or prosecute a case that was made by a ship. You need all of that, and you need it all together. So it is a table with many legs, and so we need to specialize across our domain, across the many specialties that we, quite honestly, have been somewhat of a jack of all trades, but certainly not a master of the critical few that we need to master into the 21st century. And again, I could not be more pleased with the talent that I see coming into the Coast Guard. I was at our recruiting office in Boston, and I gave 2 OCS oaths to new officers joining the Coast Guard. Annapolis had their graduation a week and a half ago. Ensign Anna Ward, instead of putting stars on her shoulder boards, put a Coast Guard shield, and I thanked the CNO and I said, thank you for your service, welcome to the team. Now this really threw me for a shock. I was at the Sea Air Space Convention 3 weeks ago, and we had a static display there in one of our E3s, and her ODUs, our work uniform, demonstrating one of our small boats. She's assigned to Station Washington here on the Potomac River. And I asked her, what did you do before you came in the Coast Guard? I was in the Navy, I'm in the Air Force in this case. Well, what did you do in the Air Force? Well, I attended the Air Force Academy. Well, when did you leave? Well, I left after I graduated 5 years and I picked up my master's degree, and I resigned my commission as a captain in the Air Force so I could be an E3 in the United States Coast Guard because I want to be a rescue swimmer. So when you talk about talent in your service, don't judge anybody by how much stuff they have, how many ribbons, how many stripes, whatever. Just engage in a conversation and you would be amazed at the talent that is in our midst. So what am I doing to train, retain, that talent, and that is really the essence of where we need to be focused on going forward. So that's just a scene setter. I know we've got an open time for open mic here, question and answer, and there are some folks that are going to stump me out there, I can tell already. But I would like to open it up to any questions, comments that you may have. And again, I want to thank CSIS again for allowing me to be here this morning. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Great, thanks. First, we'll chat a little bit and then open it up. I'm really pleased that you ended there on the human capital piece, because I was really struck going through the charts beforehand in your conversation about just the incredible amount of both continuity and change that the Coast Guard is experiencing. And then to end up on the people piece of it, the kind of workforce you need to deal with that. I wonder if you can speak from a mission perspective. You talked about everything from, of course, the Arctic, and we'll talk about several of these, trafficking, fisheries, general regulation, law enforcement, port security, and about the need to be operating with international partners, industry partners, interagency partners, inter-service partners. That to me speaks to just a wealth of agility that you require out of your workforce. Can you talk a little bit about how you grow those sort of leadership skills, and whether that's the same as it's always been, or is there something that's shifting in how you approach that?
One, we've got tremendous talent that's out there, but they're much better informed, and gone are the days where you own the information. I think back to when I've been captain of the ships, and you get the message board, and there's only a select few people that sign off on that. I doubt we do that anymore, because pretty much everyone on the ship knows what's happening around the world with them today. But I'll give you an example. I was actually in Memphis, Tennessee, not that long ago, and we have a inland river tender. It's called the Coast Guard cutter Kankakee. And they maintain the aids to navigation on the lower Mississippi River. And I asked the junior most person, she's a seaman on this ship. She's been in the Coast Guard all of 6 months. Now, if you don't know what they do on an inland river tender, we have fixed aids on the banks of the Mississippi River. Vegetation grows over them, so if you're pushing a barge and you can't see that day board, then there's a possibility you may run aground. So these crews, they push their barge in, and they go out there with chainsaws and weed whackers. They stir up fire ant nests. There's snakes underneath that piling. And it's not what you think you've joined the Coast Guard to do. And she's been in the Coast Guard for all of 6 months. And I said, well, what do you do in the Coast Guard? She goes, I facilitate the movement of over $500 billion of commerce so it can get down the Mississippi River. She doesn't talk about the bee stings, the fire ants, the snakes. She talks about what her mission is in a much grander scale. But I think if you talk to any one of our folks that are out there, I mean, they connect themselves to something much bigger than themselves. If you look at what the NASA model was, back in the 60s, I mean, that seaman is no different than the janitor at NASA of what are you doing here? I'm putting a man on the moon. So they connect to the much bigger piece, and you'll find that pretty much wherever you go in our service. But I think it's because so much more information is readily available to our people as well.
Mm-hmm. You also touched on resources. The resource picture for the Coast Guard looks maybe better than normal. I don't want to overstate it. I'm sure you'd like more, but you've made comments in the past using paraphrasing the Jaws line about we need a bigger boat, saying we need a bigger Coast Guard. How do you feel about the resource picture now that the FY17 budget request is in? You mentioned several of the new major investment streams underway. The growth of the structure and the readiness picture. What most challenges you at this point in executing all that?
I am immensely pleased with our acquisition budget. On the other side, we have our operations and maintenance, what it costs to do operations, and people come under that funding portfolio as well. And we're not keeping pace. In fact, we're not even keeping pace with Budget Control Act funding levels. We are funded below that level to sustain our operations. So it's great that we're modernizing. The sustainment piece is still a bit of a challenge for me, and that's the work that I need to do, and demonstrating how critical that is. Because let's face it, I've been to enough commissioning ceremonies now. more than I have decommissioning ceremonies. That's a good thing. You know, more births than funerals. And so it's a great gala event. But that's where the real expenses of that platform start to kick in, because now you own it for the next 40 years. It's not on warranty, and so now you need to operate and maintain that for the next 40 years, to include, you know, the salaries of the crew, the fuel you burn, and the maintenance that goes with all of that as well. So that's really going to be the next piece. And so when you talk about JAWS, you're going to need a bigger boat, you're going to need a bigger Coast Guard. So you can go back to 1988, and in almost every presidential election cycle since 1988, there's been a rather significant hurricane. I always call it the perfect storm. You know, in the height of a presidential election cycle, you now have a storm, and let's face it, it will invite scrutiny over how that response goes. Now, if we only have a hurricane and nothing else, I know the Coast Guard is ready for that. We just finished up an exercise last week in the Pacific Northwest called Cascadia Rising. It's the Cascadia subduction zone, and with that, you don't get that 96-hour advance notice that you're going to have a trembler, you're going to have a tsunami, and you're going to have tens of thousands of fatalities that impact critical infrastructure. But if I have two events at the same time, you know, I am, as I would say, out of Schlitz. So I think that's the challenge of, you know, we are currently resourced for a relatively benign operating environment, but whether you look at overseas threats and then natural disasters exacerbating that as well, we're going to need a bigger Coast Guard going forward.
And you mentioned this explicitly today with regard to the European migration crisis. I think the United States has pledged or said it would attempt to assist and provide, in particular, to provide a vessel to assist. Does that impact you directly? And you talked about the trade-off. How does that really manifest in terms of what the trade-off looks like? Well,
I'm pleased that we've had a dialogue. In fact, our Vice Commandant, who is now a confirmed and wearing you know, a 4-star, he is an O10 in the Coast Guard, to be the Coast Guard's emissary with Greece, with Turkey, looking at their challenges and where there might be U.S. Coast Guard equities. And so we've had those dialogues. There's no immediate request for us to disband our Coast Guard presence here and send those ships to the Mediterranean. But we do bring a lot of subject matter expert in mass migration. So we've had those dialogues, and we'll see if those actually manifest themselves into a request for U.S. Coast Guard augmentation to this very vexing, and quite honestly, it's going to be a persistent problem as we now see sub-Saharan, arguably economic migrants, and maybe not refugees, that are now entering into this diaspora that is flooding the European continent.
Yeah. And just to be clear, if you had to rush right away, if there were a request from the president to support a migration crisis with, for instance, one of your cutters, what would be the operational impact for you in the immediate?
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't have a ghost fleet that's tied up somewhere ready to be activated to support a contingency like this, which would mean, you know, we would have to pull a resource away from doing frontline operations today and put that operational element at risk. We've got a significant migration flow coming up primarily from Cuba, but also from Haiti as well. And probably just worth, you know, 2 weeks ago, we came across a Rustica with 11 Cuban migrants on it. And right as we arrived, all 11 of them drank a bottle of bleach. They passed it around among themselves. And suffering very ill effects. We were able to stabilize them, but that's the act of desperation that these migrants were expecting to be medevac to a U.S. hospital and therefore be feet dry. So they realize that the Coast Guard is there to stop them, and they'll take these acts of desperation just to gain access to the United States. But if the Coast Guard is not there in the numbers that we are today, then it's a free pass. And I think we need to be ready. So if we do reposition the Coast Guard, then we need to be able to answer what are we doing to protect our maritime boundaries as well. So at the end of the day, we can't do both.
Yeah. Let me ask one last question, then I'll open it to the audience, which is, of course, the Arctic. Tell me a little bit about just how you see this Arctic environment evolving in terms of the actors and what their motivations might be and how the Coast Guard plays into that.
Yeah. My initial concern for the Arctic is really the indigenous inhabitants of the Arctic. I was up there last summer, and the week before I arrived, They had what we would call a Category 1 hurricane. And normally there would be a sea ice barrier that would prevent any buildup of seas and any coastal erosion. Well, the nearest ice was nearly 400 miles away. So you can imagine you've got 18, 20-foot combers washing in on Barrow, Alaska, and in the middle of the storm, they're out there with earth-moving equipment trying to establish a berm made out of silt so you don't have seawater inundating their only source of fresh water. And they came in probably within a length of twice the length of this room of losing their only source of fresh water. And you're seeing that across the northern latitudes where we have these indigenous inhabitants, and they're seeing their way of life change. And these are nations unto themselves. So how do we reestablish those nations? And I always look at the Arctic as the canary in the coal mine for rising ocean temperatures and its impact. And just to demonstrate that further, I'll take a delegation to Greenland in August. We'll head out to the largest glacier on Greenland, the Jakobshavn Glacier, which is moving at the rate of about 8 miles a year into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I can't fathom why it's doing that, but I can certainly observe what is happening. And if you were to look at a complete meltdown of the ice fields of Greenland, you're talking about a 21-foot rise in sea level. It's not going to happen overnight, but if that does happen, what are we doing to prepare for a rise in sea level? We just rebuilt our Station Sandy Hook following Hurricane Sandy. We probably built it on shifting sand with the expectation that it will still be there and functioning 100 years from now. So if I start looking long term of my coastal infrastructure and where I'm going to invest Coast Guard, I better be keeping climate change, rising sea level in very much at the forefront as well. And so the Arctic is where a lot of this is taking place. But the first people to witness this are the indigenous inhabitants.
Very good. Okay, let me open it up to the audience and see if we can take some questions. We'll start right up here. And the mic is coming. Please identify yourself and your affiliation if you have one. Okay.
I'm Megan Myers. I'm the Coast Guard reporter at Navy Times. I wanted to ask, what are some of your biggest personnel wins over the past couple of years, and what do you have on the docket for the next couple?
Okay. Personnel wins. Very pleased with our leadership program that we have for all of our enlisted personnel, and I give great credit to our Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. So we have, from the most junior level to the most senior level in our enlisted workforce, a leadership continuum going all the way up to E9 in the Coast Guard. We're still catching up in that regard when it comes to our officer leadership development programs, and there's just a question of capacity. The area I'm immensely pleased with is we have a diversity and inclusion strategic plan as well. And so we are finally catching up to reflect the demographics of this nation within our workforce in the Coast Guard. I've taken a personal effort. I've been out to this last year to 7 minority serving institutions. Now when I go there, I don't go by myself. Someone doesn't want to see some old guy like me and says, now why would I want to join the Coast Guard? So I bring in a very diverse delegation with me. We meet with the president of these universities, with the faculty, but then we meet with the students. And they get to see a diverse Coast Guard and the opportunities that are available to them. And so it's been a great recruiting tool for us as well. To the point where, as I've said before, if I was trying to get into the United States Coast Guard today, which is still a complete meritocracy, I would be standing outside that wall watching the Corps of Cadets parade on that field. And I did okay in the Coast Guard. Every one of those folks in that parade field are going to do just phenomenally in the Coast Guard.
Great. Okay, we've got one right here. Second row.
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. Thank you for a really illuminating report. My question is this: the State Department has been explaining the complexity of its relations with Russia. And I'd like you to say a little bit about the experience of the people who are working with Russia over Arctic issues. What are some of their issues? What's their negotiating style? And if you talk about any other kind of encounters you have with the Russian naval fleet or their equivalent of the Coast Guard, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah. I'll say this, and I spent probably better part of 3 hours just one-on-one interacting with my Russian counterpart. Because when Canada hosted the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, their parliament would not allow Russia at the table. And since Russia didn't show up, nor did Norway, nor did Finland, nor did Sweden, nor did Denmark. So basically, we never got off the launching pad. But when we talk to them, they compartmentalize. They'll compartmentalize the Ukraine, Crimea, and some of the military-to-military actions. So this is the Federal Border Service of the Russian Federation. Their principal comes to meet with me. And so we can talk about the Arctic in holistic terms, safety of life at sea. All of us are challenged if we see an aggressive offshore drilling campaign in the Arctic of what is the technology that we can bring to bear to mitigate the effect of an oil spill in this very pristine environment. We also recognize that a lot of our scientific research, some of that has been compartmentalized as well. It wouldn't be to our collective advantage, even if it's something as germane as fisheries. Do we see fish stocks start to move further north? And then do we see fishing fleets going north to attract those as well? But I would say it's measured, it's compartmentalized, and it's strictly focused on the Arctic, but at the end of the day, it's productive. We are now working on an information exchange, obviously, basically via internet, where all 8 members of the Arctic Council nations at the principal level can interact with one another. So say you have an event up in the Arctic, and maybe it's our icebreaker, and for whatever reason, we get buzzed by a Russian aircraft. I can reach out to my counterpart and say, hey, what's up with this? The other service chiefs don't have that luxury, and then you have to fill that void in the absence of transparency. It remains very opaque. So I would categorize the Arctic among all of the Arctic nations as transparent, and they really gravitate towards a Coast Guard-led approach to the Arctic versus a military-led, even though they recognize we are an armed service. We're kind of unique as a Coast Guard, but they recognize the Coast Guard aspect of diplomacy in working the Arctic issues.
The Russians, of course, just last week floated a new icebreaker. You have in your budget to develop an icebreaker, but it's going to take some time. How should we in the audience think about this new icebreaker from the Russians?
Well, we often look at it as ship counts, and the Russians have 41 and we have 2. And we start looking at that as mutual assured destruction, and its missile count. And so the purpose of this Arctic Coast Guard Forum is how do we leverage the collective resources of all of the Arctic Coast Guards in the event of a contingency. We're also looking at putting together what I would call a heat map. Now a heat map is using AIS information, which everyone has access to, is where are the concentrations of the greatest human activity up in the Arctic. And in all likelihood, that's probably where is the greatest likelihood of a mishap at sea as well. So we will do a tabletop exercise this year, and we will do a full-scale exercise next year, doing a mass rescue at sea. In fact, we're not even waiting till next year. We're going to do one in August using Nome and Kotzebue. We have Norway and Canada will participate in that as well. We will have 250 role players as now displaced passengers. And then what we can't replicate is how do you replicate, the 24-hour news cycle during an exercise? And that's really the next place that you really need to go. And I used, the Malaysian aircraft and a number of others of who's in charge, and recognizing there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. You need to establish a relationship with survivors, all the nuances that go into a response. Too many times we deal with the tactical level, and we often lose sight of the fact that we will be dealing with national command authorities and on a global scale if you have a Titanic-like event in the modern era today.
Okay, I'm going to group a final 2 questions just because we're running low on time. So why don't we do this gentleman on the end and then the gentleman from him. Yes, thank you.
Admiral Jim Weekly with the Lake Carriers Association. On the Great Lakes, we're very focused on the domestic ice mission. So actually I have two questions. With all the acquisitions you have going on and the 140 rehab program, which we're obviously a big fan of, do you have the bench strength to continue to do that? And the second question, sir, is do you see the domestic ice as kind of developing your bench strength and your future icebreaker skippers for the polar mission?
Yeah.
And if you want to just hold, we'll add one more question
Okay.
and you can wrap
Take
it
them
up.
both.
Thanks, Admiral. Commodore Pete Levy. I've just taken over as the Australian Naval Attaché here in Washington, so thanks again for your presentation. Could I just at the outset, on behalf of my Navy and my nation, pass on the condolences, thoughts and prayers to all those that were affected by those events in Florida over the weekend. We're with you guys as you deal through this. My question's on China in particular, but other nations that aren't Arctic nations and their increasing interest in the Arctic region. Does that, particularly with China, does that give you cause for any concern at all?
Yeah. So I'll take the first one. On the Great Lakes, we were granted a reprieve this year with a relatively light ice season. It allowed us to buy ahead some of the maintenance that we're doing on our 140-foot icebreakers, but we're going to have to recapitalize those. Do we bring in another Great Lake icebreaker? I can't squeeze that into my acquisition budget today. If I were to prioritize my icebreaking needs, the immediate one is the heavy icebreaker. So I would need top-line relief before we could address a Great Lake icebreaker. I will be in Ottawa on the 5th of July to look to see where is Canada. As you know, we have a memorandum of agreement with Canada, so if for whatever reason we don't have the capacity, we can look to Canada to provide assistance to the United States, and that works reciprocally if they're deficient. But where are their investments as well? So we need to look at this, within the next 5 to 10 years. We're buying some service life for those 140-foot icebreakers, but that's just a service life extension. It does not get us out of debt. I also look at what's happening with weather patterns in the Arctic, and so as the waters and then the air warms, the jet stream, instead of it being more of a straight line, it meanders. And when it meanders, it brings that, frigid air, we call them polar vortexes, which are become, it's a new household term. But those polar vortexes scream across the Great Lakes, and then you get years like we had in 14 and 15, severe winters, heavy icing. And so I will not assume that, everything's going to warm up and we'll have no ice left in the Great Lakes. So it's an investment that we need to be prepared to make as well. And then finally, I'll be up there. I'll be riding a Laker here in a couple of weeks to actually see it from the wheelhouse and gain an appreciation for your world of work. So thank you for the question. If I go back to the second question on China and their role as an observer on the Arctic Council, but also they will soon launch a second medium icebreaker. It's the same issue that I have with transparency. When I see where they're doing scientific research that happens to coincide where we have an extended continental shelf, and thinking long term. I know China views this as the global commons. I'm not as concerned when I see an icebreaker doing research, but if I see a mobile offshore drilling unit now moving up there, Houston, we have a problem. And so I don't know what the long-range plan is. What is China's vision for an Arctic strategy? Beyond the global commons, where are those lines drawn? And will it encroach upon the sovereign interests of the United States? I can't answer that question, so obviously that does cause me great concern.
Well, Admiral Zukunft, thank you so much for your time today and for your incredible leadership of the Coast Guard. You make the Coast Guard sound like the most fascinating workplace in the world, and I'm sure it is. So please join me in thanking him.